The year is 1859, and the fields of Solferino, Italy, are soaked with the blood of the fallen. The French and the Sardinians have been clashing for a month, and casualties are numerous. Soldiers slaughtered and the injured left for dead. Wars like these were common, until one unfortunate witness changed this brutal treatment of injured and captured soldiers. His name was Henry Dunant.
Henry Dunant was a man of business, and on his way back from a business trip in 1859, he saw 23,000 men lying either wounded, dying, or dead on the battlefield. Repulsed by these events, he chronicled them in a book titled A Memory of Solferino.
This book developed an idea centered around a neutral organization to care for and monitor the captured and injured. The book was published, selling 1,600 copies, and received good reviews. It led to the eventual creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the beginnings of what we know as the Geneva Conventions.
Clemency for the enemy. The Geneva Conventions relative to prisoners of war.
In 1864, certain governments sent representatives to a diplomatic conference in Geneva, Switzerland. The conference entitled The Care for All Sick and Wounded Military Personnel, regardless of nationality. They would also recognize the neutrality of medical personnel, hospitals, and ambulances identified by the familiar emblem of a red cross on a white background. The treaty was called the Geneva Convention. The Second Geneva Convention occurred in 1907 and was added for the purpose of amending and extending the treaty to sailors wounded or shipwrecked on the battlefield.
The most renowned and prominent of these conventions came next, the Third Geneva Convention, which was in regards to the rights of prisoners of war, or POWs for short. In 1921, the International Committee of the Red Cross expressed their wish of a convention on the treatment of prisoners of war to be adopted. The reason behind this? The numerous violations and incidents of torture in World War I. At the time, German authorities did not hesitate to crack down upon their captives, subjecting them to malnutrition and punishments both psychological and physically degrading. There was nothing in place to protect them, their lives at the mercy of their captors. And one may think, why would nations at war help those of the opposite faction, the enemy? The difference between prisoners of war and the sick and injured is that you do not feel inclined to help them. They are no different than who you face off on the battlefield. So why should you treat them any different?
The Geneva Convention of 1929 achieved an establishing of standards on the humanitarian treatment on a specific group of people, prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention was a breakthrough in rights history because it was this idea that ensured you gave rights to someone you most probably wouldn't in an armed conflict, the enemy, only because they would do the same for you.
The ICRC drew up a draft treaty of 97 articles, which was submitted at a convening of nations at Geneva in 1929. Some of the most important key points consisting in the prohibition of reprisals and collective penalties, the organization of prisoners' work, the designation by the prisoners of representatives, and the control exercised by protecting. All seemed well, and the goal of taming warfare seemed almost complete. Then disaster struck.
That the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii from the air. I'll repeat that. President Roosevelt says that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
Japan's swift attack on Pearl Harbor started the U.S.'s descent into World War II. From Iwo Jima to El Alamein, the battle was gritty, not only on the battlefield, but off. Prisoners' rights were violated. The atrocities committed in the recent context of the 1929 Geneva Convention, disgusting.
They ran me down with pitchforks. then they took me into town, women were throwing rocks at me and whatever they could.
The events of the Pacific Front was especially horrific, despite the fact that the Japanese had signed the conventions. 2 out of every 3 soldiers alive at the time of the surrender did not live to see the end of the war. The treatment of American POWs was so vile. Prisoners were often worked to death, and when Red Cross inspectors came to the camps, the sick were replaced with healthier captives for show. The war seemed like it would never end, but soon it did. On May 8, 1945, it was Victory Day in Europe, signifying the grinding halt of the Nazi war machine. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese also signed their formal surrender, but it was not over yet. The generals of the High Command had to be trialed.
And so began what is known as the Nuremberg Trials, not only for the genocide of entire populations, but for crimes against prisoners of war. This trial was a huge step in terms of international law, and also brought upon the last and final convention, the Geneva Convention of 1949.
This convention replaced the Prisoners of War Convention of 1929 and extended the treaty to civilians. It contains 143 articles, whereas the 1929 convention had only 97. The categories of persons entitled to prisoners of war status were broadened to the wounded and shipwrecked in accordance to the first and second conventions. The conditions and places of captivity were more precisely defined, particularly with regard to the labor of prisoners of war, their financial resources, the relief they receive, and the judicial proceeding regarding them. The convention establishes the principle that prisoners of war shall be released without delay after the hostilities.
Soldiers today have been protected by these conventions in battle. Without this important stepping stone forward, we would fight every battle like Solferino. Like the Japanese, prisoners of war would be killed and tortured, helpless. The Geneva Conventions ensured that captured troops returned to their nations, unharmed. It limited the barbarity of something barbarous in nature, war. For if there was no Geneva Conventions, there would be no justice on the battlefield, no clemency for the enemy.